That's nasty.
What is going on, guys? Welcome back. Chuck Nasty on Fantasy Football. It is week 11, and it's Thursday. You know what that means. We drop the stardom, sit-em for the week. Quarterback, running back, wide receivers, and tight ends. People that have good matchups, people that have bad matchups, people you shouldn't play, people you should play. Try to avoid all of the super obvious ones. There's a couple obvious ones that I just really like this week that I wanted to put in here. And as always, if you are a new viewer to the channel, we drop a couple of videos every single week to help you and your fantasy football team. I drop streaming defenses on Tuesday night before the waivers clear that help you get an advantage over your competitor in your matchup that week. And then we drop the stardom sit-em videos on Thursday, which are players that you should play or shouldn't play based on information that I've mined from data. Patterns, trends, regression analytics, a combination of all sorts of things. So that's it. Subscribe to the channel. Support me while I give you information to be better at fantasy football. That would be ideal. And then we make money together because I win my leagues, you win your leagues, you beat all your buddies, and you don't have to tell them where you got the information from. So let's get right into it.
Start 'em and sit 'em.
I'm starting Josh Allen this week, Buffalo Bills, quarterback against the Miami Dolphins, who are 26th in fantasy points allowed at the quarterback position. This guy's kind of interesting, to be honest. He doesn't throw for more than 250 passing yards on any given week, but his legs get him most of the way there for fantasy anyways. So he is the 6th highest scoring quarterback since his bye week in week 6. And he scored at least 2 touchdowns every single game since week 5. So I am starting him this week against the Miami Dolphins. I'm also starting Jimmy Garoppolo, quarterback, San Francisco 49ers, against the Arizona Cardinals, who are 31st in fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position. You might be a little bit hesitant after watching him throw to Kendrick Bourne and Dante Pettis on Monday night against the Seattle Seahawks because they couldn't catch a cold. It was atrocious. I feel like I could have done a better job catching those balls and those receivers. It was like they had oil on their hands or grease or something, and the ball was just flying through it. Don't let that stop you because Jimmy G had the highest points he's had this entire season against the Arizona Cardinals in week 9. He had 28.88 fantasy points at the quarterback position. So it's a top-tier matchup. And he should be getting Emmanuel Sanders this week, who is absolutely a Wolverine of repairing himself and fighting through injury. But if he plays, everything's golden, and I would highly recommend it. So definitely playing Jimmy G this week. I am also playing Kyle Allen, quarterback for the Carolina Panthers, against the 27th in fantasy points allowed to quarterback position, Atlanta Falcons. Kyle Allen threw for 300 yards against Green Bay last week, and Atlanta is averaging 298 passing yards against in most matchups. So every single quarterback that has played against the Falcons has put up at least 2 touchdowns against them. Fire up Kyle Allen this week. Another guy to potentially start. This isn't an immediate, I'm going to pull a quality starter out of my lineup to put him in there. But Nick Foles against the Indianapolis Colts, who are 13th in fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position. So it's kind of a middle-of-the-pack matchup, right? They're 13th. They're obviously in the top half of that. But the Jags have thrown 14 passing touchdowns this year and 1 rushing touchdown. So if I had to guess how the Jaguars are going to try to beat the Colts, it's probably not going to be with Leonard Fournette on the ground. I think it's going to be Nick Foles throwing passing touchdowns. So he's got a good shot of putting up a couple of touchdowns this week and worth a shot if you are in dire need. But some guys that I'm sitting this week, Jared Goff against the Chicago Bears, who are 9th in fantasy points allowed at the quarterback position. I don't think I've seen a streakier team this year at all, besides the Rams. It's affecting the wide receivers. Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, and Todd Gurley even are not posting consistent fantasy numbers because of how streaky this team is. But more importantly, he has put up an average of 3.42 fantasy points in 2 of his last 4 games Chicago's held opposing quarterbacks to 270 passing yards and 1 touchdown in each game. It's not a week for Jared Goff to bounce back, so I'm sitting him this week. I am also sitting Mitch Trubisky. I'm not sure you needed me to tell you that. If you needed me to tell you that, you might need Jesus. You might need something more than this channel to save your fantasy football season. But either way, Trubisky is actually pretty athletic, which is the crazy part. The problem is that he panics after his first read is not there and then just overthrows all of his potential wide receivers. It's really unfortunate if you're a Bears fan because he was picked ahead of guys like Patrick Mahomes and Sean Watson, which is absolutely nuts to me now, obviously. But more importantly, he has scored under 10 fantasy points on 6 different weeks so far this year and has a bad matchup with the Rams D this week, who are 12th in fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position. I don't want it. I don't want it at all. Don't do it. I'm also not starting Carson Wentz this week against the New England Patriots, who are first in fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position. That means there's nobody better at not allowing quarterbacks to score fantasy points than the Patriots so far this year. Wentz is, he had a pretty good week last week, actually, surprisingly. But he's only averaging 12.4 fantasy points over his last 3 games. And the Patriots D has not allowed less than 10 fantasy points, or has allowed less than 10 fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. And unless your name is Lamar Jackson and you're going to get all your points from your legs, it's not worth starting against the Patriots D. So pop him on the bench this week. I'm also benching Kyler Murray against the San Francisco 49ers, who are second. Comes directly after number 1. So there's only one team better, and it's the Patriots against the quarterback. This is a bit of a different situation, all right? I'm going to give you my read on it. So Kyler has put up 23 fantasy points or more in 2 straight weeks. He had a pretty solid game against San Fran in week 9, where he put up 23.04 points. But if you remove the outlying 88-yard touchdown that Andy Isabella caught, the numbers would look significantly different. I'm playing the odds here because most quarterbacks averaged 9.47 fantasy points per game against San Fran this year. But just be careful with that information. We've obviously seen what happens when you have this new breed of quarterback, the Lamar Jacksons, the Kyler Murray, that get a good boost in their floor by rushing yards, by making defenders miss. They seem to sort of defy logic when it comes to having a bad matchup. So it's one of those deals where he might well have another good week against the 49ers. I'm playing the probabilities, and I'm sitting him on my bench this week. Getting into some running backs to start. I'm starting Josh Jacobs against the Cincinnati Bengals, who are 30th in fantasy points allowed to the running back position. Remember I told you about all of the starts and sits are like not the obvious ones? Well, clearly, this is an obvious one because Josh Jacobs has been a legit RB1 this year. I drafted a ton of him this year. I had him in a lot of videos in August, if you were subscribed to the channel back then, about what I thought he was going to do this year, and he's exceeding expectations. He is scoring the 10th most points at the running back position, making him a legitimate RB1, and he's averaging a ton of carries per game, 22.7 since week 4. Those are workhorse numbers, and I love it. Cincy allows the second most rushing yards per game at 116, and this matchup is going to be sweet. So I'm starting Josh Jacobs this week. I'm also starting Melvin Gordon against the Kansas City Chiefs. You might think that this one's obvious as well. Well, Melvin Gordon started off the year pretty slow when he came back to the Chargers, and the Chargers actually looked like they got worse when he came back. But he stumbled. He seems to be picking up some speed and momentum, and I think a matchup against the 31st ranked Kansas City Chiefs run defense is going to be his bounce back week. So there's only one team that's given up more fantasy points to the running back position than Kansas City. And did you see Derrick Henry run for 188 yards last week against the Chiefs? Yikes. I'm starting Melvin Gordon this week. I'm also starting Brian Hill, running back, Atlanta Falcons. If you don't know who that is, you probably didn't get him off of waivers this week, even though he was the hottest pickup with Devonta going down. Plays against the Carolina Panthers, who are 29th in fantasy points allowed at the running back position. He was the hottest waiver ad this week. He scored touchdowns in back-to-back weeks. He had 21 carries last week. But more importantly, starting running backs have averaged 30 fantasy points per game against the Carolina defense. So start him this week. I'm also starting my boy, Raheem Mostert, running back for the San Francisco 49ers. Must start, as I call him, because Matt Breida, that guy that's super talented, catches a ton of balls, and is a great PPR addition to your team, that goes into a game, gets injured, leaves. Goes into the next game, gets injured, leaves. It's just this never-ending vicious cycle. And the problem is that the last time one of these running backs was out, it was actually the other one, Tevin Coleman. My boy, Raheem Mostert, moved up on that depth chart, had 28 touches and 3 receptions for 230 yards and a touchdown in those 2 weeks that Tevin Coleman was out. So there's going to be a ton of opportunities against a 20th ranked Arizona Cardinals run defense this week, and I'm starting Raheem Mostert. A couple of running backs to sit this week. Jordan Howard, Philadelphia Eagles against none other than the New England Patriots, who are 4th in fantasy points allowed at the running back position. The reason I put this in here is because Jordan Howard has scored touchdowns in the last 2 games, but he has a really disgusting matchup this week. The Patriots have only allowed 1 rushing touchdown this entire season to running backs. Given that Jordan Howard doesn't really catch passes, it doesn't make him a great addition or give him an opportunity to actually score many points, so I'm sitting him this week. I'm also sitting David Montgomery, running back for the Chicago Bears, against the Los Angeles Rams. So they're 10th in fantasy points allowed to the running back position. My biggest disappointment with David Montgomery this year is he had a killer matchup last week against the Detroit Lions. Totally failed to perform, only had 60 rushing yards, and he's got a much worse matchup this week. But overall on the season, he's averaging a pretty pathetic 41.4 yards per game if you take out the outlying 125-yard game that he had. So I'm not starting him this week. But let's get into some wide receivers to start. I'm starting Julian Edelman against the 27th ranked Philadelphia Eagles. The reason I put him in here is because he hasn't scored a touchdown in 3 of the last 4 games, but he's averaging 12 or more targets in the last 4. Interesting stat against the Eagles is 7 of 9 receivers to catch 5 or more targets against Philadelphia have had at least 100 yards receiving. So look for Julian Edelman to have a big game this week. I'm also starting Marquise Hollywood Brown against the 29th ranked Houston Texans. Scored a touchdown last week. It was the Bengals, so there's that. But Houston is giving up a ton of points this year. But more importantly, they have given up 30 passing touchdowns through 10 weeks. I think Marquise Hollywood Brown has a good shot at going back-to-back on TDs this week. I'm starting him. I'm also starting Cole Beasley against the 26th ranked Miami Dolphins. Beasley's had double-digit fantasy points in 6 of 8 games in PPR formats, and 6 or more targets each week this year except for 3. Opposing slot receivers against the Miami Dolphins averaged 6.5 receptions for 93 yards and 1 touchdown in the last 2 weeks. I'm starting Cole Beasley this week. A couple of guys that I am not starting this week at the wide receiver position. Alshon Jeffrey against the number 1 ranked New England Patriots. He's averaging 7.3 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks. And no D has allowed less fantasy points to the wide receiver position than the New England Patriots. They only have 1 receiving touchdown to receivers all year against their defense. But my biggest problem with this is that Patriots, what they tend to do is they take away the number 1 option in an offense. So they make you beat them with that 2nd, 3rd, or 4th option. The number 1 option in this passing game is Zach Ertz. If they take Ertz away, that may give Alshon Jeffrey an opportunity, but I still just don't feel confident starting him this week, so I'm plopping him on the bench. I am also benching Stephon Diggs, wide receiver Minnesota Vikings, against my number 3 ranked Denver Broncos. Everybody knows I'm a huge Denver Broncos fan. It's no secret. I'm not a homer in that I don't play my own guys against the Denver Broncos. But here's the scoop. Stephon Diggs has 4 total receptions for 53 yards and no touchdowns in back-to-back weeks. Total. That's his total stat line. Not a single receiver against the Denver Broncos secondary has had 51 or more receiving yards against the Denver's defense since week 3. So I don't like my odds here. I'm sitting Diggs on the bench. A couple of tight end starts this week, I'm starting Gerald Everett against the 28th ranked Chicago Bears. The Bears have a really good defense. It is what it is. They have a good secondary. They have a pretty good run D, except for a couple weeks that they got blown up by Josh Jacobs. But they're 28th in fantasy points allowed to the tight end position. So where people are scoring is in that middle area with the tight end. And I don't really like how streaky the Rams have been. We kind of talked about it a little bit, but they've been so streaky that Gurley, Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods have not been consistent fantasy performers this year, which is really unfortunate because I own a ton of all of them. It is what it is. The staple of consistency in this offense is Gerald Everett, who has gotten 10 or more targets in 3 of the last 5 games. So look for them to use Gerald Everett to get some points this week. I'm also starting Jared Cook against the 31st ranked Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He's only owned in 66% of leagues on Yahoo, which is pretty crazy. But if you're like me and you own shares of Austin Hooper and you need somebody to fill that void, this might be the guy. He's been a pretty viable tight end option for the last couple weeks, scoring 12.7 fantasy points or more in the last 3 games. Only Arizona is giving up more points to the tight end position. So it's a sweet matchup. I'm also starting Jason Witten against the 22nd ranked Detroit Lions this week. He only had 17 yards in week 10, but he averages 6 or more targets in the last 4 weeks. And all tight ends with 6 or more targets against Detroit have either scored a touchdown or got at least 60 yards receiving. The Lions have also given up 4 receiving touchdowns to opposing tight ends in the last 4 weeks. So I like my odds of streaming Jason Witten this week. A couple of sits at the tight end position. I'm sitting Mike Gesicki at Buffalo. Now, some of you are saying, I thought this wasn't obvious. You're not talking about guys that, obviously, we know I'm going to sit Mike Gesicki. Here's the scoop, though. Gesicki has had 6 or more targets in 3 of the last 5 games, so he's become a legitimate streaming option. And he had even one single 95-yard receiving game in Week 9. But outside of that, if you remove that outlier, he really hasn't had a great year. And there's only 2 teams giving up less points to the tight end position than Buffalo this year. So I am not playing Mike Gesicki this week. I am also not playing. When I say I'm not playing, I mean I have to play him in one league. I literally have no other options. Kyle Rudolph this week. So temper your expectations a little bit because here's the scoop. He had an insane, breathtaking end zone tight end catch this past week. It was sweet. He's had 4 touchdowns in the last 4 weeks. But if you look at the yardage totals, he's only averaging 18 yards a game. So they use him on the goal line for touchdowns, and that's it. If he doesn't get a touchdown, he's going to bust, and you're going to be up Schitt's Creek without a paddle. So temper your expectations for this week. I hope he gets a touchdown for my sake, even if it is against my own team in the Denver Broncos defense. It is what it is. Let's fucking tank and get a better draft pick or something. But just be aware of what Kyle Rudolph's up against if he does not score a touchdown this week. And then real quick, we'll do the picks for the week in my pick and pool. I am taking Pittsburgh tonight against Cleveland. I'm taking Dallas on the road against Detroit. Now, this is with Matt Stafford not playing as of right now, so that might change. I'm taking Indy at home against Jacksonville. I'm taking Carolina at home against Atlanta. Buffalo on the road against Miami. Minnesota at home against Denver. Washington at home against the Jets. Baltimore at home against the Texans. New Orleans on the road against Tampa. San Fran at home against the Cardinals. New England on the road against Philly. Oakland at home against Cincinnati. Rams at home against the Bears. And Kansas City on the road against the Chargers. That's all I've got for this week. I wish you guys the best of luck going into the weeks approaching the fantasy playoffs. If you have questions or roster questions, comments, concerns, you don't like how good my picks are, you think my picks are bad, I'm just kidding. Don't tell me that stuff. Just whatever. Let me think they're good. Tag along. Hopefully it wins you some money. Subscribe to the channel so that I can continue to put out good content to help you guys. Connect with me on social media. My Twitter is in the description down below, at ChuckNastyGG on Twitter. If you have any questions, that's an easy way to reach me. I get notifications for Twitter messages, so I will always try to get back to you and help you with your lineup. So that's all I got this week. Good luck.